Congressman Scott Perry, our guest on Face the State this week. Charlie is here, Tony is here, but I wanted to ask you first, Scott, about your effort to end the raid on the Crime Victims Fund in Washington. A quote from you, Washington has a spending problem when it's willing to steal money from victims of child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other crimes to keep the funds flowing. Right. How are you proceeding?
Unconscionable. Well, we've got a bill. We're working with the Senate, actually working with Senator Toomey on this thing to make sure that the victims of the crimes are the ones that actually get the money as the statute.
I mean, this is money being diverted.
Diverted,
that's
right?
Already in the fund.
Right. It's actually in the fund. I think in 2014, 12 billion was in the fund, but they only handed $3 billion out to the victims of the crime. So the rest was just taken, and that's not the way to balance the budget, in my opinion.
Tony?
Change the topic. First, congratulations are in order. Since we last saw you in this program, you've been promoted to Brigadier General in the Army National Guard, a great honor, and I'm going to serve with distinction. Let me ask you a Guard question. In the past, when we've had refugees from foreign nations, Vietnamese refugees, Marielitas from Cuba, they were housed temporarily at Indian Town Gap Military Reservation, National Guard facility. Is that a possibility going forward here with the Syrian refugees?
Well, I imagine that'll be up to Governor Wolf if they're going to be housed somewhere, but generally speaking, the process has changed now. We don't have this en masse group of people coming from Vietnam or from Cuba, and we don't know where to put them, so to speak. They are vetted. And there's a problem. There's a question of the vetting process, but allegedly they're vetted overseas, and by the time they end up in Pennsylvania, the agencies already have a place for them, so there's not a big mass group that needs to be housed. So I don't really see that as a possibility under the current paradigm.
Charlie.
You spoke previously with Rob about the vote last week, bipartisan, by the way, almost 50 Democrats joining the Republican majority. Say let's pause in the Syrian refugee influx. At the same time, 31 governors were saying no thank you in our states, including the governors to the east and to the west of us. But Tom Wolf says, in effect, come on in with no further questions asked. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction is that he's the governor of a state, and he's taken an oath and a charge to protect the people of this state. And while I certainly respect his willingness to give the federal government a pass, so to speak, on accepting whatever they say robust vetting is robust vetting, I think it's important that he really know about that system to make sure that the people of Pennsylvania are protected. And even from Democrat members, like I just talked to one last night who said to me, I talked to the chief of staff and I talked to Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, and they have not given me the answers that make me feel comfortable with this, which is why I voted in favor of the resolution.
Well, the director of the FBI said there were gaps in the process.
Absolutely. Everybody has said there are completely gaps in the process. So with all due respect to the governor, I wish he would be a little more skeptical and do a little more due diligence. There's a reason why 31 governors have said we want to pause on this thing. Let's make sure we're getting it right. And it seems to me the responsible thing to do is just not accept carte blanche the federal government's cry that everything's fine, there's nothing to see here. Make sure that the citizens of Pennsylvania are protected first. That's your first duty.
Tony, from the left.
Going back to the terrorism situation, the reports in other countries of high alert because of the threat of terror attacks are imminent or have been threatened. There have been vague threats about the United States. Is Pennsylvania prepared to deploy its National Guard? Are you trained to handle these kind of urban situations where something
Well, I think you could just base that on the last exercise or operation with the Pope, right, where you saw the en masse in Philadelphia. No incident, so I think the Guard is well prepared to do what needs to be done.
So it takes some. Our viewers can take some solace that
your guard is definitely, Pennsylvania Guard is ready to go. But I do think that we need to decide whether this is the kind of world we live in. I talked to a student last night who had a trip planned to Washington, D.C. It's been canceled because of the fear, right? And there's a lot of that. And if that's how we want to live as Americans, and to me, that goes to governance, it goes to rhetoric, and if we're saying we're going to just allow these folks to come in and accept a substandard vetting process, then we're accepting we have to live that way. We don't have to live that way. We're making a choice to, and I think we can make the other choices to live safe.
Congressman, I just saw a major newspaper reported last night that the small town America feels safe, but shouldn't, because the bigger cities like New York City have a lot of money to put at this, a lot of manpower, a lot of equipment, but the answer isn't to throw a lot of money at the communities. You mentioned earlier, the answer is really see something, say something.
I like see something, do something, right? Don't just say something. You have to do something, which means you either thwart it yourself or certainly say something to law enforcement or to officials or government officials. But, you know, you can never tell these days, right? I understand, and this is third-hand information to me, but the neighbors of the gentleman, the individual, the terrorist that masterminded the deal in France, in Paris, his neighbors thought he was a very nice gentleman, went to mosque every day, worshipped, and was just a very nice neighbor, had no idea that he was going to turn out to, and they, you know, that could be your neighbor, right? So that's a concern.
In what seemed to be a very common sense approach by the Congress, again supported by both Democrats and Republicans, have you been surprised by the reaction that this is somehow not humanitarian, that you've failed in what, you know, I mean, look, is a legitimate concern for the overwhelming majority of these refugees who are fleeing horrific conditions? And in that regard, I want to ask you about the reaction. What about Senator Dan Coates' proposal that we add additional money and ask our international neighbors to do the same, to take care of these refugees where they live rather than bringing them here?
I agree with that proposal, and of course I've been critical in hearings. I think that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who, by the way, Saudi Arabia certainly borders the country, why can't they be there? And the answer I got from the federal government, which gives me some skepticism, is, well, they don't fit into that culture. Oh, like they fit into the Western European culture much better. So, you know, and to be derided because you're not compassionate enough and saying this doesn't in keeping with American values. We have given more than any other country, so that's number one. Number two, it kind of belies the fact that America has been many things over the course of many decades regarding immigration and regarding refugees. And with all due respect, the Vietnamese or the Cuban refugees, when they came, there wasn't a component of them that said we're going to come and destroy America, right? That wasn't part of the conversation. So I think you have to be realistic and look at what is happening today. Things change, times change, issues change, and you need to be able to adapt to it. And I think it is. I think what we've done has been reasonable, was say, take a pause, let's look at this, and if there's a better way, and I agree with your way, Charlie, I think that would be the best way. They should be invested in their country, in their homeland. If we had when we had a civil war here, people in this country didn't go somewhere else. They fought for their country.
I was intrigued by what you were saying earlier about different terror groups around the world, not just ISIL, not just Al-Qaeda, but Boko Haram. Do you envision some sort of an international, how do you combat this? What would be the way to actually take an aggressive, positive approach rather than hands-on?
Again, I think we have to understand the radicalization of the theology. We have to understand and get our minds wrapped around the reality of that first. And then I think the community, the Muslim community, the greater community, has to have some skin in the game here and really provide some input. And then some of the countries, quite honestly, like Saudi Arabia, who's an ally of the United States and should be, but they build madrasas, they build mosques all around the world and preach this Wahhabism. That we have to apply the pressure to make those things stop, to end this continual indoctrination of young people that become radicalized as they get older and then
So you see it more as winning minds before actually physically shooting it?
We got to stop the killing first, right? The killing and the attacks have to stop. And I don't know why we can't do both. Why can't we walk and shoot?
We're way over time. I'm sorry. we all have more questions, and we're just sitting here looking at each other. Congressman Scott Perry, thanks again so much for being on the program.